For nearly 3,000 years, the world believed the Trojan War belonged to myth, a story of gods, heroes, and impossible battles. But then, archaeologists began to dig. Beneath the soil of modern Turkey, they uncovered the ruins of a city destroyed by war. In Greece, they found royal tombs filled with gold treasures fit for kings. And scattered across the ancient world, clues began to emerge that seemed to point back to the age of Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus. Were Homer's epics merely stories? Or had archaeology uncovered the remains of a forgotten reality? Let's get into it. The Iliad and the Odyssey are two epic poems written by Homer. Now, there's some debate as to whether Homer was even real, or if he was just a figurehead named for a collective as a result of centuries of oral storytelling. There's also one theory that Homer was actually a woman because of how well described the weaving and other female-centric activities are in these poems. Anyways, I digress. The Iliad and the Odyssey are just two works in what is considered an 8-volume cycle of works that tells the story of the Trojan War. Now, the Iliad and the Odyssey are the only two preserved in full, and the rest only survive in fragments, so we actually don't know the entire story, and we likely never will unless AI can unwrap some more of those goodies from the Library of Herculaneum. The Iliad covers the final year of the Trojan War, where we get Patroclus' death, and Achilles seeks revenge by killing Hector. The Odyssey recalls Odysseus' trials and tribulations on his 10-year journey to get back to Ithaca and his family. This is where we learn of the Trojan horse, and we also get some great scenes with monsters and a bunch of mishaps along the way. Now, what evidence can we take from these two poems to discern if they are based in any reality? It's generally accepted that the Trojan War likely took place at the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, which we can somewhat align with the Bronze Age collapse, but we won't be waxing poetic about the potential correlation and its implications here. Starting at the source, Homer does describe Mycenaean armor with extremely accurate detail, which is very impressive in its own right, given that the poem was allegedly written 500 years after the supposed war took place. The boar's tusk helmet that is given to Odysseus is exactly what Bronze Age soldiers would have worn. Does this give us concrete proof that it happened? No, but it does lend some credibility to Homer's story and the events that took place. The Iliad and the Odyssey could then be a great piece of historical fiction with some real events or aspects of the past being woven in. Either way, good on Homer for this one. Looking at the ancient world itself, it does also seem that the site of Troy that we have all identified and agreed is Troy was also agreed upon in antiquity as the legendary location for this fabled war. As early as the 7th century BCE, we have archaeological evidence of ancient tourism to visit the walls of Troy, where people who wanted to see where Patroclus tried to scale the sloped base and perhaps even run around the walls like Achilles and Hector did would come and marvel at these heroic relics. The fortification walls that were associated with the citadel of King Priam were even repaired multiple times in antiquity, showing just how central they were to Ilium or Troy's tourism industry, just like they are today. Alexander the Great was one of these ancient Troy tourists, and there is a record of him racing around the supposed burial mound of Achilles with his friends and donning antique armor. When Brian Rose excavated this tumulus, he found that the residents of Ilium had actually added about 26 feet worth of dirt on top of it in the 3rd century BCE. He said that they were essentially turning the area into a Homeric Disneyland, which really helps paint the picture of how even 2,000 years ago, people were all just as obsessed with seeking out the truth in the story as we are. Ancient people did firmly believe that the Trojan War happened. This is why we see so much of this tourism and travel to legendary sites. And not just to Troy and Ilium. We also have evidence of people visiting Ithaca and making offerings at the Odysseon to a deified Odysseus. So that's a slice of what we can discern from the ancient world itself and how they perceived it. To them, the Trojan War was a very real event and part of their historical canon. Moving forward in time, medieval Europeans continued to believe that the Trojan War was an historical event, and we even have a lot of dynasties claiming lineage of Trojan origin. But once we get to the early modern era, we do start to see some people getting a bit more critical, a bit more skeptical even, of these legendary poems. In the 17th century CE, we have mathematician and physicist Blaise Pascal calling the story a romance and claiming that nobody supposes that Troy and Agamemnon existed more than the apples of Hesperides. Homer had no intention to write history, but only to amuse us. This sentiment continued well into the 19th century, and the stories of Troy were just thought of as fables. That is, until one very specific person came along. We all know who I'm talking about. It's Heinrich Schliemann, and Rachel from Inside Archaeology is here to tell that part of the story.
Hey Raven, thanks for having me. And don't forget to check out the partner video to this one discussing Homeric archaeological discoveries and objects on my channel right after you finish this one. Right now, let's take some time to dig in to when the story of the Trojan War went from fact to myth to fact again. People in ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, and even into the medieval period thought that the Trojan War was a historical event. However, by the 1800s, it came to be regarded by scholars as fictional, and that's where a German, capital A amateur, archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann comes in. And I am only begrudgingly calling him an archaeologist here, okay? I have beef. You will understand. Born into a poor family, he amassed a sizable fortune in the St. Petersburg Stock Exchange that allowed him to effectively retire when he was 36. I wish. And pursue his life's goal, finding the ancient site of Troy. He went to Paris to study archaeology and find out everything that he could about ancient Greece, including teaching himself the language. In 1869, he was awarded a PhD in absentia for a dissertation that he has since been accused of copying from another author's work, and then he set out to start digging. There is no doubt that he was single-minded and driven in his ambition, but he would say just about anything to get what he wanted. For example, he got tired of waiting for the Ottoman government to give him a permit to dig and decided to start without it, heading to the Trojan Plain in Anatolia, a landscape already known for the fact that the Iliad happened here, but with no concrete evidence of it yet. He went first to the site of Pınarbaşı, which at the time was commonly believed to be Troy. It was a hilltop at the south end of the plain, which had been previously excavated by English amateur archaeologist and local expert Frank Calvert. Schliemann's diary contains complaints about the weather and the diet of rice, peppers, and tortoise. He shows very little interest in pottery, which is a capital archaeological sin if there ever was one. His illicit digging came to the notice of the Turkish government, and he soon had to grovel to officials to repair the damage. However, his work at Pınarbaşı didn't give him the results that he wanted, and Calvert suggested that he try his luck at the site of Hisarlik. Contrary to popular belief, Schliemann was not the first person to dig there. It was noted as a potential archaeological site by Richard Pocock in the 1740, and then Franz Koffer in 1793. In 1801, Edward Daniel Clark first identified it as Troy based on coins and inscriptions that he found, and then Charles McLaren claimed that it was Homer's Troy. John Brunton was the first to dig there, followed by Frank Calvert, who actually didn't get enough funding from the British Museum to continue his dig, so he passed the opportunity on to Heinrich and missed out on the chance to be known as the founder of Troy. Now, we have to keep in mind that this was the early days of archaeology when our methods were still being developed, but even by those standards, Schliemann was a total cowboy. Reading his excavation monographs is painful for a modern archaeologist. He excavated using winches, crowbars, battering rams, and the favorite tool of antiquarians, dynamite. He whacked a 17-meter deep trench through the site, bulldozing his way through 9 layers of human occupation down to bedrock, assuming that his Troy would be at the bottom, because, you know, there can't be anything possibly before that. Ironically, he went right through the real layer that dates to the time in which the Iliad is potentially set. In 1873, he found a hoard of gold jewelry, gold, silver, and bronze vessels, silver ingots, and bronze weapons and tools, which he immediately claimed was the treasure of King Priam mentioned in Book 24 of the Iliad. Pairing this with the remains of walls that he had found and a layer of burnt material that, must have come from the destruction of the city by the Greeks, he claimed that this proved that Hisarlik was Troy. However, later examination has shown that actually Priam's treasure predates the Trojan War by about 1,000 years. And if you even look at Book 24, it doesn't even match its description of various robes and garments, gold talents, tripods, cauldrons, and a Thracian cup. After smuggling the treasure illegally to Greece and then having to pay a hefty fine to the Ottoman government, Schliemann moved on to the site of Mycenae, which had already been identified in the 1700s due to the famous Lion Gate, which was mentioned in historical sources. At Mycenae, he excavated a grave circle containing even more gold treasure, like some of us just have all the luck, including several funerary masks, one of which he later claimed belonged to Agamemnon, even though there is no evidence to link it to the famous king. This grave circle, too, has now been shown to predate the Trojan War by at least a few hundred years. So as you can see, Schliemann was all too happy to jump to conclusions without any conclusive evidence behind them. This and his tendency to lie and exaggerate his finds, like the famous story that his wife helped excavate the treasure and then smuggled it off-site in her shawl when it's been proven that she was actually in Athens, have led some scholars to accuse him of faking and planting his discoveries for attention. Yet, despite all this, he has gone down in history as the man who proved that the Trojan War happened, when actually he did no such thing.
Archaeologists have been excavating Troy for the last 150 years, and with so much work done in one place, you'd think that we'd have it all figured out by now. Spoiler alert, we don't. So let's dig a bit deeper into these campaigns and see what we can match with the archaeological record to the bits of the story, both at Troy and beyond. Firstly, let's look at the city of Troy itself. Homer puts Troy at the mouth of the Dardanelles and describes that one would sail in from there into a great bay. Homer also claims that it would have had trading relations with Mycenae. Sample cores taken in the plain in front of the archaeological site of Hisarlik, also known as Troy, show that at the time of the Trojan War, the city would have stood above, you guessed it, a great bay, which silted up during classical times. So on that side, the geography works. Next, Homer speaks of the sacred tower of Holy Ilios by the main gate of the city, where Hector's wife, Andromache, watches as Achilles kills her husband. There is actually evidence of a tower enclosing an altar and fronted by idols of the Trojan gods in real life, which might indeed be a genuine memory of the gate tower of Bronze Age Troy. Homer also says that the Greeks almost broke through into Troy 3 times when Patroclus tried to scale the slope of Troy's walls. But in his story, the sun god Apollo battered him back each time. Now, Troy is divided up into 9 major archaeological layers, but we know there were 10 different settlements. If we look at the large fortification walls dating from Troy 6, one of the 2 layers dating to around the time period when the Trojan War would have taken place, we can see that they do indeed have a distinctive angle to them. This might not have been unique to Troy, though, and I'm sure they weren't, because it's a great defense mechanism. Staying with the walls, Homer says that at one point on the western side, there was a section that was badly built, and this is where the goddess Athena told the Greeks to attack. Archaeologist William Dürpfeld, who took over the excavations at Troy after Schliemann, did indeed find that on the western side, one section of the old circuit had not been replaced by newer walls. Well, now Homer's just getting spookily accurate, so maybe there is some deep-rooted memory of a battle that made its way into legend and myth. Though I should say that it does look like it's multiple legends conflated together. For example, the descriptions of Hector's and Ajax's axes are quite large for the late Bronze Age, so they may have been characters from earlier legends that made their way into this Trojan epic. Finally, one last note on Homer's writings and its physical correlations before we get into the real archaeological evidence. We have to talk about the catalogue of ships. The catalogue appears in Book 2 of the Iliad and lists 164 places where all the Greek forces sailed from. It sounds super boring, it kind of is, but it is also a historical goldmine because we now have a list of places to search for. And get this, Half of the 164 names have been identified, and all of those have exhibited traces of Mycenaean occupation. Homer, you sly devil. Are you actually giving us a history lesson here? I've kept you on tenterhooks enough. Let's have a proper look at what else we've been able to find in the archaeological record. As I mentioned earlier, there are 2 layers with evidence for destruction that date to the time period in which the Trojan War would have taken place. We have Troy 6, dating to the 13th century BCE, and Troy 7, in particular Troy 7a, dating to the 12th century BCE. The settlement at Troy 6 dates from 1700 to 1275 BCE and was the largest and strongest / most fortified Bronze Age settlement, with a large fortification wall surrounding the citadel and a huge ditch completely encircling the lower city. The fortification walls were over 12 feet thick and over 27 feet high. These were insanely defensive, and I dare say, downright the stuff of legend. They were made of limestone on the base and topped with mud brick. The ditch was 1,200 feet south of the citadel and measured 12 feet wide and 6 feet deep. It's also likely that there was an inner defensive wall after the ditch, but we haven't found any evidence of that yet. Nevertheless, this citadel/ditch combination has been called one of the most sophisticated surviving defense systems from the late Bronze Age and made the city practically impregnable. Think about it. If you're on a chariot, which you likely are because this is Hittite territory and they were master charioteers, you'd have to get off your chariot or your horse, go down into a ditch, somehow make it back up, and then run 1,200 feet just to get hit with a wall 27 feet high that you then somehow have to scale, all while probably being shot at with arrows and other very scary projectiles. Troy 6 was a literal Fort Knox. Very much so the stuff of legend. But why would a settlement have a reason to be so fortified? Well, Troy is at a very key location on the Anatolian coast, and that area was alternately claimed by both the Hittites and the Greeks. Everyone would have wanted to control the Dardanelles and the trade passing to and from the Black Sea. Such an advantageous spot would have attracted many would-be conquerors to their walls. We don't know the level of traffic passing through the Dardanelles and the Black Sea, but any power-hungry tyrant would have wanted control over a key location such as this. You can't protect yourself from everything though, and in 1275 BCE we see a destruction layer at Troy 6, likely from an earthquake. The Great Walls were damaged, and you can see that although Troy was not abandoned, people were having to alter their way of life. The walls were eventually repaired, but we now see people moving from outside the citadel and taking refuge inside of it. The interior of the citadel once had these very large rooms, but now we see it getting crowded with houses. New walls are being put up to separate larger spaces, and we also find enormous storage vessels sunk into the floors. This is clearly a population in distress, taking shelter and hunkering down, trying to recover from a major natural disaster. And it doesn't seem like just a simple rebuilding project. With so many people moving into and around the citadel wall, security must have definitely been a concern post-earthquake. Such large storage jars indicate that people were trying to bring enough supplies inside to last them a while behind the protection of the walls. This period of makeshift houses and subsistence living shows up in the archaeological level of Troy 7a, and this was destroyed around 1200 BCE. Not even a century after the earthquake. The destruction level here, though, is not of natural causes. The layer itself measures up to 5 feet deep in some areas of the site and consists of burnt timbers, arrowheads, human skeletons, and piles of sling stones. The human skeletons were not properly buried, indicating that this was some sort of tragedy, and sling stones strewn about like that show that they were intended to be used for an attack, because they would have eventually have been cleaned up and stored away after the fact if the Trojans were successful in their victory. So we do have evidence for some sort of battle and destruction at Troy, around the time when the story of the Trojan War would have taken place. Hate to break it to you, but there is no evidence in this destruction layer for any wooden horse that could have breached the walls. It wouldn't really have survived if there was one anyways. And we also don't have definitive identification as to who attacked Troy. Was it the Achaeans? Was it someone else? We may never know. This period saw the destruction of many citadels in both Greece and Turkey, including famous sites from the Iliad and the Odyssey, like Mycenae and Pylos, and even the Hittite capital of Hattusas. This widespread destruction is typical of the Bronze Age collapse, and the main reason isn't agreed upon, but it was probably a combination of warfare, climate change, and earthquakes. Now, unlike the films, and maybe even the Homeric epics, Troy was not abandoned forever after this destruction at level 7a. No siree, the human spirit, as ever, is resilient. The walls were repaired and new houses were built, continuing this 7th settlement, and after a brief 200-year abandonment after another earthquake in the 10th century BCE, Troy saw habitation all the way up to the Roman period and beyond. By looking at the evidence from these archaeological excavations, it's easy to say that there was indeed some sort of attack and destruction at Troy during the alleged time that the Trojan War is said to take place. Was it a 10-year siege waged in the name of a face that launched 1,000 ships? Probably not. It might have been a raid, a foreign leader even, taking advantage of a city in crisis. We do see that the pottery being produced at Troy around 1130 BCE is similar to forms being produced in the Balkans at this time, and some scholars assume that means there was an influx of people from southeastern Europe settling down at this site. But there is no evidence that the settlement was a result of this attack. So, since we can't say anything definitively about the Trojan War happening from this physical evidence, we have to try and find other ways. And for that, we go back to Rachel.
The lack of definitive evidence of the Trojan War at Hisarlik means that to look for more evidence that it might have happened, we have to look a bit further afield. At the time that the war may have been going on, the city of Troy was on the edge of the Hittite Empire, who, luckily for us, really liked to write stuff down. Troy appears in several of their records as Wilusa, a small vassal state. One particular record mentions the empire fighting with a people called the Ahiawans over Wilusa. Ahiawa sounds very similar to Achaia, one of the names used for the ancient Greeks. A different tablet names a ruler of Wilusa called Alexandru or Alexandros, which is another name used in the Iliad for the Trojan prince Paris. In 2024, an Oxford linguist scholar tweeted about a new discovery of a Hittite tablet containing details matching the Iliad. The document was a letter addressed to King Pariamua, aka Priam, and mentions that Troy was under attack by the sons of Atarshia of Ahiawa, aka the sons of Atreus, Agamemnon, and Menelaus. The sender mentions that he, from Luca, or Lycia, sent troops to Pariamua, but the king had not responded to him, and asks what has happened to Crown Prince Alexandru. The sender then mentions that they sing in Luwian of the destruction of steep Wilusa, and includes a fragment of a poetic lament describing the destruction of Troy, with a rhythm and invocation that is very, very similar to that of Homer's prose. It fooled a lot of people, myself included, but sadly it was actually fake. An elaborate April Fool's joke that when you look at this person's Twitter, he actually puts out something like this like every year. As there are still thousands of Hittite tablets waiting to be translated, it's possible we might find more clues as time goes on. Ironically, a tablet like the April Fool's one is exactly the kind of evidence that would help prove the conflict actually happened. And this led Raven and I to having a chat about the kind of evidence of the war that could still be out there. The famous Thracian cup mentioned as being part of King Priam's treasure, a sign saying, "Welcome to Troy, ruled by King Priam and Queen Hecuba." The remains of Mycenaean boats, either along the reconstructed ancient coast or farther out into sea. Linear B graffiti at Troy saying Agamemnon was here and burned it to the ground. The remains of Mycenaean weapons, bronze helmets, spears, swords, arrows, figure of 8 or tower shields, a golden urn containing the ashes of a male individual who died in his early 20s with Mycenaean ancestry, aka the remains of Achilles. Genomic reconstruction of DNA from Mycenaean sites showing that some people had matrilineal ancestry from the west coast of Anatolia and are aka the descendants of the Trojan women that were taken to Greece as war trophies.
At the end of the day, we can confidently say that yes, there is evidence of the Ahiwahans, the Achaeans, or the Greeks fighting with the Wilusans, or the people of Ilios, or the Trojans. And yes, we also have evidence of some sort of aggressive tragedy befalling the city of Troy in the late Bronze Age. But can we say without a doubt that the Trojan War, the way that Homer wrote it, actually happened? I don't think so. The Iliad and the Odyssey are stories rooted in deep memory. They weave a tale of history and legend, creating a narrative that has survived and captured our imagination for millennia. Many other great wars or battles might have been fought around this time, and they probably were. But because Homer was able to spin a yarn as fantastical as this, we remember it. I like to think that the story sprouted from a tragedy and grew exponentially to a fantastical story of heroes and gods and monsters as a way for us to keep the memory of that time and place alive, and to solidify an era of deeply flawed and human heroes that we can all relate to and learn from. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and thank you to Rachel for collabing on this video yet again. If you liked that video, you know what to do. Smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, and now that you have all of the evidence, let me know in the comments if you think that the Trojan War actually happened. Stay dirty, my friends!